December 2nd, 1942, 21:40 hours. Admiralty House, London. Coal smoke hangs low over Whitehall. Frost clings to the iron railings. Inside a dimly lit conference room, a revolver cracks like a rifle shot. The bullet slams into a pale block propped against the far wall. Instead of shattering, the slab spits the round back in a wild ricochet. It screams past startled officers and buries itself in plaster. Silence. A thin mist rises from the block under the electric lamps. It looks like ice. It is not. Rear Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten lowers the smoking Webley. His eyes move across the room, measuring the reaction. Civil servants stare. Naval architects lean forward. One man swallows hard. "This," Mountbatten says quietly, tapping the frozen surface with a gloved knuckle, "is pykrete." Outside, the Battle of the Atlantic is bleeding Britain dry. Convoys crawl through Blackwater between Halifax and Liverpool. In the mid-Atlantic gap, far beyond land-based RAF Coastal Command patrols, German U-boats hunt without fear. Wolfpacks surface at night, engines growling, silhouettes invisible against moonless seas. Torpedoes streak. Tankers split open. Sailors burn in oil slicks that turn the ocean into a furnace. You can almost hear it. The thud below decks. The hiss of steam. The scream swallowed by winter wind. Britain needs air cover in the gap. Needs it desperately. But there are not enough escort carriers. Not enough steel. Not enough time. Across the table sits Geoffrey Pike, eccentric inventor, eyes bright with something between brilliance and madness. His proposal lies open in folders stamped most secret. A ship 2,000 feet long, 600,000 tons. Flight deck capable of launching and recovering bombers. Hull not of steel, but of reinforced ice mixed with pulp, a material stronger than concrete, resistant to torpedoes, nearly unsinkable. The officers shift in their chairs. Ice. Mountbatten nods toward the block again. A technician strikes it with an axe. The blade bites, but does not cleave. Fibers hold the frozen mass together like tendons and flesh. Pykrete, 14% wood pulp, 86% water, frozen slowly to bind the cellulose into a matrix. The result does not shatter like ice. It absorbs shock. A torpedo would gouge, not pierce. Damage could be patched with hoses and seawater. Imagine it, a floating island in the Atlantic, aircraft roaring from its deck, depth charges falling from the sky onto unsuspecting U-boats below, a fortress where no steel yard is required. Churchill has already scrawled in the margin of the proposal. The advantages are so enormous that it must be pursued. Yet even here, in this smoke-filled room, doubt seeps in. How do you prevent it from melting? A captain asks. Refrigeration coils. Pike replies. A vast internal cooling system. Insulation. Continuous freezing. The hull would be 30 feet thick in places. Internal hangars carved into its frozen heart. Workshops. Fuel storage. Crew quarters for thousands. It sounds like something from a fever dream, and yet the mid-Atlantic gap grows deadlier by the week. Convoy ONS 154 has just lost 14 ships. Sailors freeze in lifeboats before rescue can reach them. German BDU reports boast of success. Admiral Karl Donitz tightens his wolfpack formations, confident that beyond the reach of land-based liberators, the Atlantic belongs to him. The room feels smaller. Mountbatten walks closer to the block and places his palm against it. Cold seeps through leather. If we cannot build carriers fast enough, he says, we shall grow them. A nervous chuckle dies quickly, because he is not joking. In Canada, on remote lakes in Alberta, preliminary experiments have already begun, small-scale prototypes. Refrigeration plants humming in the wilderness. Engineers in parkas studying stress fractures in reinforced ice. The code name is Habakkuk, after the prophet who spoke of wonders beyond belief. Outside, sirens wail faintly over London. Somewhere in the dark, a Luftwaffe bomber, maybe crossing the coast. War presses in from every direction. Inside this room, a different kind of weapon is being conceived, not forged in steel mills, not riveted in Belfast yards. Grown. Mountbatten finally holsters a revolver. Gentlemen, he says, the Atlantic is devouring our lifeline. If we cannot close the gap, Britain starves. His gaze sharpens. This may be the only way. The officers look again at the block that refused to die under gunfire. Steam curls from its surface like breath in winter air. Ice that does not break. A carrier that cannot sink. A plan born of desperation. And far out in the black Atlantic, beneath rolling swells, a U-boat captain peers through his periscope at another burning freighter and believes the ocean belongs to him. He has no idea something impossible has just been set in motion. January 17th, 1943, 2:15 hours. North Atlantic, 600 miles west of Ireland. The convoy is blind. Snow lashes sideways across the decks of 27 merchantmen, pushing east in staggered columns. Their bows rise and slam against iron-gray swells. Signal lamps blink through spindrift. Somewhere in the darkness, the destroyer HMS Viscount cuts a nervous arc along the perimeter, her Aztec pings echoing uselessly into empty depths. Above, there is nothing. No Sunderland flying boat. No B-24 Liberator from RAF Coastal Command. They cannot reach this far. This is the mid-Atlantic gap. And beneath the surface, Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Brandt steadies his U-boat, U-523, at periscope depth. Condensation drips from steel bulkheads inside the pressure hull. The diesel engines are silent. Electric motors hum softly. Red lights bathe tense faces as torpedo men slide AG-7 into Tube 1. Brandt raises the periscope by inches. Through the lens, he sees silhouettes against starlight. Fat tankers. Slow freighters. Smoke trailing low. He whispers a bearing. His first watch officer calculates lead angles on the attack plot. Distance, 1,200 meters. Speed, 8 knots. Los. Compressed air thunders. The torpedo leaves the tube with a metallic shudder. Seconds stretch. Then another launch. And another. On the surface, able seaman Thomas Wilkes feels it before he hears it. A vibration to the hull of the SS Empire Lytton. He turns toward the port rail. The explosion splits the night. A column of flame erupts from the tanker's midsection. Steel plates buckle outward like paper. Burning fuel pours into the sea. The shock wave slams Wilkes to the deck. His ears ring. Somewhere aft, a second detonation tears open cargo, holds packed with ammunition. Men scream in the dark. HMS Viscount increases speed. Screws churning white water. Her captain orders a hard turn toward the blast. Depth charges roll into the racks. Aztec pings now return to contact. Too late. Another freighter shudders as a torpedo strikes beneath the bridge. Lifeboats tumble from davits before crews can man them. Oil spreads in a shimmering carpet across the waves, ignited by floating debris. Brandt lowers a periscope and orders a dive to 90 meters. Inside U-523, sailors grip handrails as depth charges begin to fall. The first detonations bloom above them, dull concussions hammering the hull. Dust sifts from overhead piping. Gauges flicker. He smiles faintly. The wolfpack will finish the rest. Across the Atlantic, reports like this flood Admiralty charts. Red pins multiply across blue expanse. Entire convoys mauled in waters aircraft cannot patrol. The Germans call it the happy time. Donitz calls it arithmetic. Tonnage sunk versus tonnage built. Britain calls it catastrophe. In Liverpool, dock workers unload what few ships survive. Crates of ammunition, sacks of grain, fuel drums essential for bomber command raids over the Ruhr. Each cargo manifest now reads like a gamble with death. You can feel the pressure in Whitehall. Each sinking is a tightening noose. Escort carriers exist, yes, but too few. Their steel hulls require shipyards already stretched to the limit producing destroyers, corvettes, landing craft. The United States is building at speed, but hulls take months. The Atlantic devours ships faster than rivets can be hammered. And so the impossible proposal gains gravity. In Ottawa, British and Canadian officials meet in guarded rooms. Engineers from a National Research Council study stress tolerances of reinforced ice. Refrigeration specialists calculate heat transfer rates in sub-zero climates. Could a vessel be maintained below freezing even in summer swells? They sketch cross-sections, 30-foot thick hull walls, internal cooling ducts circulating chill brine, a skin of wooden insulation, steel reinforcement only where absolutely necessary, a runway long enough to launch twin-engine bombers that could patrol the gap for hours, a floating airfield beyond range of land. Back in the Atlantic, HMS Viscount drops her final pattern of depth charges. Oil rises to the surface. Debris floats. The captain marks a position as a probable kill. But you, 523 slips away in darkness, battered yet alive. By dawn, 5 merchant ships are gone. Hundreds of sailors drift in lifeboats. Faces rime with frost. Some will not see rescue before exposure takes them. From Berlin, propaganda broadcasts boast of another victory against the British lifeline. From London, Churchill reads casualty figures in silence. The mid-Atlantic gap remains open, a black corridor where no Allied wing flies. Yet somewhere in the frozen wilderness of Alberta, carpenters and scientists begin constructing a test platform on Patricia Lake. They work beneath towering pines, cutting blocks of pipecrete and fitting refrigeration pipes through its core. A miniature hull takes shape against snowbound mountains. It looks absurd. It looks fragile. But when a rifle round strikes its side and fails to penetrate, the observers exchange uneasy glances. If this material can endure gunfire, what might it withstand in open ocean? Far out at sea, Brand orders you, 523 back to periscope depth the following night. Another convoy approaches. Another opportunity. He believed the Atlantic will remain his hunting ground for years. He does not know that on a remote Canadian lake, the first frozen skeleton of Leviathan has already begun to take form. March 4th, 1943, 11:30 hours. Patricia Lake, Alberta, Canada. The lake is a sheet of white glass framed by the Canadian Rockies. Snow settles in soft layers over pine branches. Beneath the stillness, engines thrum. Men in heavy parkas move across a skeletal framework, rising from the frozen surface. Timber beams form a rib cage. Between them, workers pack a slushy mixture of water and would pulp into wooden molds. Steam coils snake through the structure like arteries. Pipecrete, as the mixture freezes, it hardens into something uncanny. Not brittle like lake ice. Not smooth like a winter pond. It feels fibrous under a gloved hand, dense and stubborn. A pickaxe strikes it and rebounds with a dull crack. Lieutenant Commander Edward Durnford of the Royal Canadian Navy walks the length of the structure, boots crunching on frost. He studies thermometers embedded deep inside the forming hull. -15 Celsius. Stable. He exhales, watching his breath plume into air. This is only a prototype, 60 feet long. A fragment of what Habakkuk is meant to become. But already it demands refrigeration units powerful enough to cool a warehouse. Diesel generators cough smoke into the mountain air, feeding compressors that push chill brine through pipes hidden within the frozen mass. Without that artificial winter, the structure would sag by spring. Engineers huddle over blueprints inside a canvas tent. Cross-sections reveal an aircraft carrier unlike anything afloat, 2,000 feet from bow to stern, a beam wider than most battleships, a hull thickness measured not in inches but in yards, internal hangars carved into the ice, elevators lifting aircraft to a wooden flight deck above. They calculate displacement, 600,000 tons, more than twice the weight of HMS Ark Royal, and nearly impossible to sink. A torpedo striking such mass would detonate against a wall 30 feet thick. It might gouge a crater. It would not punch through to vital compartments. Damage control would consist of hoses spraying seawater to refreeze the wound. In theory, Durnford kneels and places a gloved hand against the surface. It is solid, unyielding. He signals for a test. A worker shoulders a lee, Enfield rifle and fires at close range. The crack echoes across the valley. The bullet embeds shallowly. No fracture spreads. One engineer grins despite the cold. If you were standing on the deck of such a vessel in the Atlantic, you would feel something different beneath your boots. Not the vibration of steel plates, but a muted solidity, like frozen earth. The sea could hammer against it for days. Yet questions persist. How do you steer a mountain? Naval architects debate propulsion. Conventional screws would require immense power. Some propose electric motors along multiple shafts. Others consider segmented rudders the size of small ships. Then there is speed. Habakkuk will never outrun a U-boat. At best, 7 knots. It would not chase. It would sit in the gap like a fortress, aircraft launching and rotating patrols. Fairy Swordfish, perhaps, or Grumman Avengers once American production accelerates. Anti-submarine patrols radiating outward like spokes. The concept is simple. Deny the wolfpacks their sanctuary. Back in London, Mountbatten presses a combined chiefs of staff. Churchill remains fascinated. At the Quebec Conference, he reportedly places a block of pykrete in President Roosevelt's bathtub to demonstrate its durability. The Americans are skeptical, but intrigued. Steel is precious. Ice is abundant. But abundance does not equal feasibility. At Patricia Lake, spring sunlight begins to lengthen each day. Despite refrigeration coils humming relentlessly, edges of the prototype soften by afternoon. Workers shovel fresh snow along exposed sections as insulation. Thermometers are checked hourly. One afternoon, a compressor stalls. For 20 minutes, coolant flow drops. Engineers watch in tense silence as surface sheen turns glossy. A faint trickle forms along one seam. Not catastrophic, but enough to remind them this ship survives only by constant cold. Imagine maintaining such refrigeration in the Atlantic, where summer swells reflect relentless sun. Fuel consumption would be staggering. Machinery failure could mean structural sag. Still, the prototype floats. They flood a channel beneath it and watch as the structure settles into water, buoyant and eerily stable. It does not crack. It does not fracture. It rides the surface like a frozen barge. Durnford notes the data carefully. Load distribution appears even. Stress fractures minimal. In Ottawa, cost projections climb. Tens of thousands of tons of wood pulp required. Massive refrigeration plants. Skilled labor diverted from other war industries. And yet, as convoy losses continue through early 1943, the idea refuses to die. Because every week, more ships burn in the gap. One evening, as dusk settles over Patricia Lake, Durnford stands alone beside the prototype. The mountains reflect pink in the frozen surface. The structure casts a long, unnatural shadow. He tries to picture it at sea. 2,000 feet of white mass rising from gray waves. Aircraft engines roaring overhead. U-boats diving in panic as depth charges fall from a sky they once owned. It would change the Atlantic overnight. But even here in perfect cold, he sees condensation forming along exposed edges. A reminder, Habakkuk is not a steel dreadnought. It is a living thing that must be kept frozen, hour by hour. And thousands of miles away, in the black waters of the mid-Atlantic, another convoy has just signaled contact. Wolfpack sighted. May 28, 1943. 9:10 hours. London, Combined Operations Headquarters. Rain streaks the windows as blueprints are unrolled across a long oak table. The room smells of damp wool and pipe tobacco. Admirals, engineers, and Treasury officials lean over drawings that depict something closer to a floating continent than a ship. Habakkuk is grown on paper. Now the proposed length stretches beyond 2,000 feet. The beam widens to support twin runways. The hull thickness increases in critical sections to resist not just torpedoes, but Atlantic swells that could flex and fracture lesser materials. This is no longer a speculative oddity. It is a full engineering undertaking. Chief Naval Constructor Sir Stanley Goodall studies the stress calculations. Traditional steel vessels rely on frames and longitudinal stringers to distribute load. Habakkuk would rely on mass. Sheer bulk resisting bending moments across her length. But even ice reinforced with wood pulp has limits. Wave action in the North Atlantic can induce hogging and sagging forces powerful enough to snap a Liberty ship. What would it do to a frozen Leviathan? Engineers propose internal steel reinforcement at key stress points. A lattice embedded within pykrete to absorb tensile strain. Refrigeration pipes would weave around the skeleton. Circulating brine chilled by compressors the size of factory engines. Power generation becomes a central question. To maintain sub-zero temperatures across such volume, Habakkuk would require continuous refrigeration equivalent to a small city. Diesel engines would burn thousands of gallons daily just to keep her frozen heart intact. Fuel storage must be integrated within insulated compartments, protected from heat transfer. You can picture it. Deep inside the hull, machinery rooms humming without pause, engineers monitoring gauges, coolant lines vibrating. A warship whose survival depends not on armor alone, but on refrigeration discipline. Mountbatten listens as projections are read aloud. Construction time, at least 8 months once materials are assembled. Manpower, diverted from other naval projects. Estimated costs, climbing steadily. Yet losses in the Atlantic have begun to shift. In recent weeks, long-range B, 24 Liberators equipped with improved radar have extended patrols deeper into the gap. Escort carriers like USS Bogue are entering service. HF/DF radio interception improves convoy routing. The tide may be turning. But in May 1943, that turn is not yet guaranteed. Across the table, a Royal Air Force liaison officer studies flight deck plans. Habakkuk could host squadrons of anti-submarine aircraft operating in continuous rotation. With a runway this long, even heavier bombers might land for refueling. A permanent air presence in the once untouchable center of the ocean. It is seductive, a fortress immune to torpedoes. A platform too vast to sink. Yet, doubts sharpen. How do we tow her into position? One captain asks. At 7 knots maximum speed, self-propulsion remains theoretical. Some suggest assembling her near Newfoundland and allowing ocean currents to assist positioning. Others propose multiple tug convoys, a risky undertaking across submarine-infested waters. And what of enemy air attack? While pykrete resists penetration, repeated bombing could crater the deck, disrupt refrigeration lines, expose insulation. Repairs at sea would require constant freezing under fire. Goodall taps the blueprint where the hull curves upward toward the bow. She will not behave like steel, he says quietly. Flexibility is minimal. Stress concentrations could propagate unseen. A fracture inside 30 feet of frozen composite would be difficult to detect until catastrophic. Meanwhile, at Patricia Lake, the prototype endures its first thawing test. As summer approaches, engineers reduce refrigeration output deliberately. They monitor deformation. Edges soften. Minor warping occurs near uninsulated surfaces. Nothing dramatic but instructive. Without continuous cooling, Habakkuk would die slowly. Back in London, Treasury officials clear their throats. The cost of pulp alone rivals that are constructing multiple conventional escort carriers. Shipping with fiber from Canada. Installing refrigeration plants. Diverting skilled engineers during wartime scarcity. Every pound allocated to ice is a pound not spent on steel. Mountbatten remains steadfast. He argues that Habakkuk is insurance, a strategic shock weapon. The mere presence of such a structure could alter German naval calculus overnight. Imagine a U-boat commander surfacing at dusk, expecting defenseless merchants, only to find an ice cliff rising from the sea, aircraft launching overhead. Shock has value, but war is arithmetic. Reports from the Atlantic arrive during the meeting. Convoy battles intensify. Yet U-boat losses have spiked dramatically. Allied air coverage, code-breaking, and improved escort tactics begin to claim submarines at alarming rates. Donut's wolfpacks are bleeding. The room grows quieter. If the gap closes through conventional means, what becomes a Habakkuk? Outside, rain intensifies against the glass. Inside, the blueprint of a frozen colossus lies under electric light. Lines precise, calculations meticulous. For months, it has represented salvation. Now it risks becoming redundancy. Mountbatten folds his hands. The decision will not be made today. But somewhere in the Atlantic, beneath gray swells, a U-boat captain hears aircraft engines overhead for the first time in waters he once believed safe. And the window for a floating Iceberg fortress begins, slowly, to narrow. July 24th, 1943. 1840 hours. North Atlantic, southwest of Iceland. Low clouds scrape the horizon. The sea rolls in long steel-blue ridges under a fading sun. On the flight deck of the escort carrier USS Bogue, a Grumman TBF Avenger shudders as its engine roars to full power. Deck crew crouch low, armed signaling. Launch! The Avenger lunges forward and lifts cleanly into wind, wheels snapping upward as it banks toward open ocean. This is what Habakkuk was meant to provide. But steel has arrived first. Out here, once beyond reach of land-based aircraft, Allied air patrols now prowl. Radar sets scan the surface with a faint silhouette of a snorkel or conning tower. Lee lights pierce night darkness like artificial suns. In the operations room below deck, a young radar operator leans over his scope. A blip flickers. Faint, intermittent. Contact, bearing 085. Within minutes, the Avenger adjusts course. The pilot scans through breaks in cloud. Then he sees it, a shape slicing the surface. U-613. The submarine captain orders an emergency dive the moment he spots the aircraft shadow. Ballast tanks flood. The hull angles downward. Too slow. Depth charges tumble from the Avenger's wings and strike the sea in a staggered pattern. Seconds later, geysers erupt. Underwater shockwaves punch the U-boat's hull like giant fists. Light bulbs shatter. Instruments jolt from mounts. Men are thrown against bulkheads. The ocean that once concealed them now betrays them. Across the Atlantic and London, intelligence summaries show a clear trend. U-boat losses have spiked dramatically since May. New radar, improved convoy tactics, huffed-up direction finding, and air coverage from escort carriers are shifting the balance. The mid-Atlantic gap is shrinking. At Patricia Lake, the prototype of Habakkuk endures summer sunlight with refrigeration at maximum output. Compressors drone day and night. Engineers track energy consumption and calculate what a full-scale vessel would demand at sea. The numbers are sobering. To maintain structural integrity in temperate waters, refrigeration plants would need constant operation at enormous fuel cost. The larger the hull, the greater the thermal exchange. Even minor mechanical failure could compromise vast sections. Lieutenant Commander Durnford studies deformation reports from June heat waves. Surface sag measured in centimeters. Not catastrophic, but cumulative. A warship cannot sag. In Ottawa, budget committees examine revised estimates. The project's cost has ballooned beyond initial optimism. Would pulp supplies compete with paper production and other industries vital to wartime communication? Steel reinforcements, once minimal, now appear necessary to ensure rigidity. The ice carrier begins to look less like an alternative to steel and more like an even more complex hybrid. Meanwhile, convoy ONS-5 crosses the Atlantic with heavy escort and air support. In early May, it had suffered grievous losses. But by July, coordinated defense and air patrols inflict severe damage on attacking wolfpacks. German submarines are hunted relentlessly. Captain Lieutenant Brandt, now commanding a different U-boat after U-523's near destruction, reads BDU signals with tightening jaw. Orders grow more cautious. Morale falters as losses mount. The Atlantic is no longer a shooting gallery. Back in London, Mountbatten receives fresh Admiralty assessments. Escort carrier production is accelerating. American shipyards churn out hulls at astonishing speed. Long-range Liberators now operate from newly secured airfields in the Azores, further compressing the gap. What was once a void is filling with wings. Habakkuk's strategic necessity weakens by the week. Still, advocates argue for its psychological impact. An unsinkable platform, a statement of industrial audacity, a fortress immune to torpedoes. But war does not reward symbolism alone. On a gray morning at Patricia Lake, engineers conduct a final stress test on the prototype. They simulate localized damage by drilling into one section and allowing controlled thawing. The surrounding material holds, but cooling demand spikes sharply. Generators strain audibly. Fuel logistics for a full-scale ocean deployment would be staggering. Durnford walks the perimeter slowly. The structure that once seemed revolutionary now appears cumbersome. He imagines towing a 2,000-foot block of frozen composite across submarine-infested waters, protecting refrigeration plants from sabotage or malfunction, guarding against sustained aerial bombardment. The world has shifted faster than the ice can adapt. Out at sea, the Avenger circles as oil and debris rise from below. The U-boat does not surface. On USS Bogue's deck, Sailors exchange tight nods. Another threat removed. Each confirmed kill narrows the argument for Habakkuk. In Berlin, Admiral Donitz confronts grim statistics. U-boat attrition rates are unsustainable. The wolfpacks no longer dominate the open Atlantic. The Gap, once a graveyard for Allied convoys, is becoming a killing ground for submarines instead. And in a quiet Canadian valley, compressors continue to hum around a frozen experiment that may already be too late for the war it was designed to save. Mountbatten reads the latest Atlantic briefing in silence. For the first time, he allows himself to consider a possibility once unthinkable. What if the floating iceberg is no longer needed? September 11, 1943. 14:25 hours. Quebec Conference, Citadel of Quebec. Sunlight pours through tall windows onto polished floors as Allied leaders move between guarded rooms. Outside, the St. Lawrence River glitters under early autumn light. Inside, maps of Europe and the Atlantic cover long tables, edges pinned beneath crystal ashtrays and briefing folders. In a smaller chamber away from the central strategy discussions, a familiar set of blueprints is unrolled once more. Habakkuk, Lord Mountbatten, stand beside the drawings, pointer in hand. Across from him sit American naval officers, industrial planners, and representatives from the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships. President Franklin D. Roosevelt listens quietly, cigarette holder angled upward, expression thoughtful. Mountbatten outlines a concept again. A 2,000-foot aircraft carrier formed from reinforced pikery, 30-foot thick hull, internal refrigeration grid, flight deck capable of supporting heavy patrol bombers, immune to torpedo penetration, a permanent solution to mid-ocean vulnerability. He speaks with conviction, but the tone in the room has changed since winter. Admiral Ernest King studies production figures laid before him. American yards are now delivering escort carriers at a steady pace. Liberty ships roll off assembly lines in record time. Long-range B, 24 Liberators, equipped with improved radar and depth charges, extend air coverage deeper into the Atlantic than ever before. King's voice is even. What problem does this all today? Silence follows, because the mid-Atlantic gap is no longer the abyss it was. Since the spring, Allied air coverage from Iceland, Newfoundland, and now the Azores has closed much of the void. Escort carriers roam convoy routes. Improved sonar and coordinated hunter-killer groups pursue U-boats aggressively. U-boat losses have become catastrophic. German submarine production struggles to replace crews and hulls at the pace they are being destroyed. The so-called happy time has ended. Mountbatten does not deny the progress, but he argues that Habakkuk represents strategic insurance, a floating airbase immune to torpedoes, a platform that could serve not only in the Atlantic, but potentially in Pacific operations where long distances still challenge air coverage. Roosevelt leans back slightly. He asks about cost. An American engineer presents updated projections. Materials alone would rival the cost of constructing multiple steel escort carriers. Refrigeration systems would require continuous fuel consumption equivalent to a small fleet of destroyers. Construction would divert labor and machinery from projects already underway. And then there is time. Even under optimal conditions, the first operational Habakkuk would not deploy before late 1944. By then, the Atlantic War may be decided. Mountbatten gestures toward structural diagrams. The hull thickness offers protection unmatched by steel. Torpedoes would detonate harmlessly. Repairs could be executed using seawater and pumps. But an American naval architect interjects. He points to stress calculations under heavy seas. Flexural rigidity remains a concern. Ice, even reinforced, does not respond like steel under cyclic wave loading. Microfractures could propagate internally, unseen. Maintenance at sea would be relentless. Refrigeration failure during a summer heat surge could compromise structural integrity rapidly. Insulation layers might degrade under sustained bombardment. Fire, though less catastrophic than on steel vessels, would threaten exposed flight decks and fuel stores. The conversation shifts from possibility to practicality. Outside the Citadel, the war continues without pause. Allied bombers strike German industrial centers. Plans for Operation Overlord take shape in adjoining rooms. Resources must be allocated carefully for the coming invasion of France. Every shipyard worker matters. Every gallon of fuel matters. Mountbatten senses the momentum turning. He knows Habakkuk was born in a moment of desperation. In early 1943, convoys burned in waters beyond air cover. Steel carriers were too few. Ice seemed an elegant answer, but war moves quickly. The problem that inspired the floating Iceberg is dissolving under technological adaptation and industrial acceleration. In Alberta, the prototype on Patricia Lake stands quietly as autumn cools the air. Refrigeration units cycle less frequently. Engineers document final data. The structure has proven durable within control parameters. It has floated. It has resisted gunfire. It has endured seasonal change. But scaling remains theoretical. Durnford receives coded communication summarizing Quebec's discussions. No explicit cancellation, but no urgency either. The experiment, once urgent, now waits. Back in Quebec, Roosevelt concludes the meeting with measured calm. It is an imaginative proposal, he says. But imagination must yield to necessity. Mountbatten nods, though the words sting. Habakkuk is not dead. Not yet. But it no longer commands the center of Allied strategy. As the conference adjourns, blueprints are rolled carefully and secured in folders marked confidential. Outside, the river continues its steady flow toward the Atlantic, where convoys now sail with growing confidence under protective skies. And on a quiet Canadian lake, the frozen prototype rests beneath gathering autumn clouds, unaware that its fate has just shifted from revolutionary to redundant. Type continue to generate the next section. November 3rd, 1943, 7:10 hours. Patricia Lake, Alberta. Thin ice forms along the shoreline again as morning frost settles over the valley. The mountains stand sharp against the pale sky. For a moment, it feels as if time is reversed, winter returning, cold reclaiming the experiment. But the generators are silent. Lieutenant Commander Durnford walks toward the prototype with two civilian engineers at his side. Their boots crunch over fresh frost. No diesel smoke rises. No hum of compressors vibrates through the frozen hull. The refrigeration plant has been shut down. Officially, the project has been deferred. In practical terms, it has been abandoned. They stop at the edge of the structure. Months ago, this mass of reinforced ice represented strategic salvation. Now it stands as a quiet relic of urgency. Surface textures show minor imperfections from summer stress. Hairline cracks spider outward from areas once monitored hourly. Without active cooling, the thaw will begin slowly from within. Durnford runs a gloved hand along the side. It remains solid for now, but he knows the internal temperature is rising degree by degree. Reports from the Atlantic no longer carry the desperation of early 1943. Convoys cross with manageable losses. Hunter-killer groups aggressively pursue remaining U-boats. German submarines are increasingly forced to remain submerged, their speed and endurance reduced. New Allied tactics dominate. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, once a blind corridor of death, has effectively closed. Habakkuk's purpose evaporates with it. In London, Mountbatten reviews final memoranda summarizing project's findings. Pikery has proven resilient against small arms and localized damage. Structural integrity under controlled conditions is acceptable, but full-scale implementation would demand enormous logistical commitment, continuous refrigeration, and resources now urgently required elsewhere. Operation Overlord looms on the horizon. Landing craft production surges. Artificial mulberry harbors are under development to support invasion forces. Steel, fuel, manpower, industrial focus all shift toward the coming assault on Fortress Europe. There is no room for a floating iceberg. Back at Patricia Lake, engineers remove instrumentation. Thermometers are extracted. Data logs boxed for shipment to Ottawa. One by one, auxiliary systems are dismantled. The prototype remains behind. Left to nature, through late November, internal meltwater begins to form channels. The wood pulp fibers slow collapse, maintaining shape even as edges soften. Surface sheen changes from matte white to faint translucence in afternoon sun. You can imagine standing there, listening not to engines but to subtle dripping within the hull. the quiet sound of an idea dissolving. In Berlin, Admiral Donitz confronts an Atlantic campaign that has turned against him. New snorkel technology offers hope, but Allied air supremacy makes sustained surface operations suicidal. U-boat losses mount beyond replacement capacity. The weapon that inspired Habakkuk's creation has lost its dominance. By December, snow blankets the prototype again. Cold temporarily stabilizes it. For a brief moment, it appears preserved, but without refrigeration, structural density has altered. Internal voids expand slowly. Durnford returns once more before reassignment. He stands alone beside the frozen mass. There is no ceremony, no official decoration, only the knowledge that the structure once symbolized extraordinary ingenuity under pressure. He recalls a rifle test, the bullet that failed to penetrate, the optimism in engineers' voices, the belief that they might grow a warship immune to torpedoes. War accelerated past them. The Atlantic did not wait. Steel carriers filled the void. Aircraft multiplied. Code breakers and radar operators changed the equation faster than refrigeration plants could be scaled. Habakkuk was not defeated by enemy fire. It was overtaken by progress. In early spring of 1944, as temperatures rise, the thaw accelerates. Edges slump. Internal cavities collapse inward. Sections settle unevenly into the lake. The wooden framework beneath becomes visible in places like exposed ribs. No dramatic explosion marks its end. No scuttling ceremony. Just gradual surrender to physics. By summer, little remains above the waterline but warped timber and scattered debris embedded in the shallows. The lake absorbs the rest. Years later, divers will still find remnants beneath the surface. Fragments of insulation. Rusted pipes once meant to circulate brine through a frozen Leviathan. But in 1943, as the war surges toward continental invasion, Habakkuk slips quietly from priority lists. An idea born in crisis, tested in ice, abandoned in thaw. And yet, even as it disappears beneath a Canadian lake, its audacity lingers. Because for a brief moment, in the darkest stretch of the Atlantic War, Britain seriously considered building a mountain of ice to defeat the wolfpacks. And that alone reveals just how desperate the struggle had become. August 1945. The war is ending. Across Europe, cities lie in ruin. The Atlantic, once choked with smoke and burning freighters, carries ships in steady columns again. U-boats that survive sit rusting in surrender ports, their gray hulls streaked with salt and defeat. Project Habakkuk is already fading into obscurity. In official archives, it occupies a thin stack of memoranda, engineering sketches, and budget assessments. A few photographs show men in heavy coats standing beside a white mass on a frozen Canadian lake. No grand launching ceremony. No christening bottle against the bow. Just a prototype slowly dissolving into history. Yet the idea lingers in naval circles. Because Habakkuk was not a fantasy born of ignorance. It emerged from a specific moment in the Battle of the Atlantic when Britain's survival was not assured. In early 1943, the mid-Atlantic gap represented a lethal vulnerability. Convoys sailed into waters beyond air cover and were hunted mercilessly by coordinated wolf packs. Losses threatened to strangle supply lines essential for Britain's endurance and any future liberation of Europe. Desperation sharpens imagination. Geoffrey Pike's proposal was radical, but grounded in material science. Pykrete, a composite of ice and wood pulp, demonstrated surprising compressive strength and resistance to shattering. It absorbed impact energy rather than fracturing like conventional ice. Tests confirmed its resilience against small arms and localized explosive force. From a purely technical standpoint, the material worked. The challenge was scale. A 2,000-foot carrier required not only frozen mass, but an industrial ecosystem to sustain it. Refrigeration plants would have to operate continuously. Insulation layers would need to protect against solar gain and mechanical stress. Steel reinforcement would likely be required to mitigate flexural fatigue in heavy seas. Every advantage carried a logistical cost. Meanwhile, Allied innovation advanced along parallel paths. Escort carriers rolled from American shipyards with astonishing speed. Long-range aircraft extended patrol coverage. Radar matured. high-frequency direction finding triangulated U-boat transmissions. Cryptanalysis yielded operational insight into German movements. The mid-Atlantic gap closed not through a single monumental solution, but through cumulative adaptation. Habakkuk became unnecessary before it could become operational. In retrospect, some critics dismissed the project as extravagant folly. An Iceberg aircraft carrier sounds absurd at first hearing, but that judgment ignores the context of early 1943. When convoy losses peaked and steel resources were stretched thin, unconventional thinking was not indulgence. It was obligation. Winston Churchill himself entertained the concept seriously. Lord Mountbatten championed it. Canadian engineers executed a working prototype under harsh winter conditions. The project advanced beyond sketch and speculation into physical demonstration. Few wartime ideas progressed that far without merit. What ultimately doomed Habakkuk was timing. Industrial acceleration in the United States shifted the balance faster than planners anticipated. Once escort carriers and long-range patrol bombers saturated the Atlantic, the strategic calculus changed. A floating iceberg fortress promised security, but conventional assets delivered it sooner and more flexibly. War rewards speed. By 1944, Allied convoys crossed with manageable losses. German submarine attrition reached unsustainable levels. The Atlantic ceased to be the decisive theater it had been. Resources shifted toward preparing the invasion of Normandy and the final push into Germany. Habakkuk quietly dissolved from strategic priority, yet its legacy extends beyond its abandonment. The project demonstrated the willingness of Allied leadership to explore extreme engineering solutions under pressure. It highlighted interdisciplinary collaboration between naval architects, civilian engineers, and industrial planners. It proved that unconventional materials could be considered for major structural roles if circumstances demanded. It also revealed a fundamental principle of wartime innovation. Not every viable idea remains viable as conditions evolve. If Habakkuk had been conceived in 1941, when Britain stood alone and convoy losses mounted unchecked, perhaps urgency would have outweighed cost. If long-range aircraft had lagged in development, the Iceberg carrier might have advanced further. But history rarely aligns so neatly. Instead, Project Habakkuk stands as a monument to a fleeting moment when ice seemed as promising as steel. Today, divers at Patricia Lake still report fragments resting in cold depths, a few rusted pipes, remnants of insulation, silent evidence that for a brief season, engineers attempted to grow a warship from winter itself. The Atlantic has long since calmed. Convoys have given way to container ships. Wolfpacks survive only in archives. The idea of an unsinkable ice carrier sounds like speculative fiction. But in 1943, it was strategy, a frozen response to a fluid crisis. And though it never sailed, Project Habakkuk remains one of the most extraordinary what-if chapters of the Second World War.